Hi, welcome to the virtual George Washington's birthday celebration. My name is Elise Goldberg and I'm the site manager here at Washington's headquarters State Historic Site in Newburgh, New York. Washington's headquarters is the first publicly owned historic site in the nation, opening in 1850, and it's where General Washington stayed and headquartered for the last 16 and a half months of the war. Martha was here for 12 of those months as well. Today, we are doing a virtual birthday celebration, but we do hope that you come down to the site when you can. Contact information will be at the end of the program, and if you just want to call us, you can call us at 845-562-1195 for more information. Before we start the program today, I'd like to thank the Palisades Interstate Parks Commission, the Palisades Parks Conservancy, and the Friends of the State Historic Sites of the Hudson Highlands for their support of programs like this. So please sit back and enjoy our program. Thank you.
General Wayne, I'm glad you're able to visit. I know I've received your letter and your concerns. I'd like to address those in our conversation. But I've also want to make known to you that perhaps you're not aware is that I've been maintaining copies of all the correspondence that has occurred during the war. Future historians will have, I believe, will have interest in this information. And as the war is drawing to a close, and I've had some time to look through some of the correspondence, has caused me to reflect on some of the past battles that we have fought together against the British. Some of them did not go very well, but typically I do not like to dwell on failure. However, I make an exception, and that is if we can learn something from these, or should I say, battles that did not go as planned. But I didn't want to get to your concerns, but first I thought it would be of interest to look at things we may have learned from these past encounters. And I know one of the first ones that comes to mind, of course, is Brandywine.
Yeah.
And looking back in retrospect, one of the big problems was, of all things, was maps. I did not have proper maps. I had, generalized maps of the large portions, of the area, but not specific to the area. And that ended up being one of the major problems. And one of the things I learned from that experience is the formation of this new department of surveyors and engineers, and the very great importance on their ability to create maps. Because we looked through the generalized maps of the area, and we looked at the different fords where the British might cross. But I must commend General Howe, the British commander, that he found a way around our lines which we were not aware. And if we had had proper maps, we could have had a force to block that position. And I know that General Sullivan has, unfortunately, there have been complaints. I personally do not believe that he did anything wrong. There were those that want to put blame on him, but I do not hold to those views. I believe that one of the main problems was all of the conflicting information that was coming in. So the British were observed, and then we had another report was that they were not observed, and their surprise approach from the north was totally unexpected. So I believe it was the intelligence, and I know that, getting back to General Sullivan, he only had 4 horsemen to act as couriers. So he did not have there's always been a shortage of dragoons, our necessary eyes and ears to see what was transpiring. And so he was at a disadvantage. So when he was attacked, he didn't have the proper reconnaissance to know the British coming from that surprise direction. And of course, as the battle unfolded, he butted right into the troops under your command.
Yes, sir.
And I am, of course, very grateful that in this surprise situation, you were able to reorientate the troops in such a way to provide an egress, a way for us to find a way out of this precarious situation. So it was not, how should I say, we lost the battle, but it was not a complete loss in that we were able to have an orderly retreat and were able to reform. To Brigadier General Anthony Wayne, 18 September 1777. I must call your utmost exertion in fitting yourselves in the best manner you can for following and harassing their rear. General Maxwell will have a similar order and will assist you with the corps under his command. The Army here is so much fatigued that it is impossible I should move this afternoon. I shall expect by return of the light horsemen to know where you are and when it will be in power to comply with this order. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, George Washington.
Well, General, I mean, we've been plagued with shortages of everything, not just dragoons. Our men are simply not outfitted properly, not have the right equipment, not have the right food. I've been fighting Congress over and over. You know, you've sent me out on procurements throughout my career to supply the Army, where Congress has let us down. But at Brandywine, you know, the problem of maps, we're both surveying background.
Right.
So we know the importance of good information, and not having dragoons or the eyes to tell us where the enemy is has always been a problem for us. And how? The man's a genius. He studied Caesar. You know, I love Caesar. His tactics are very good, and we were surprised. But we were able to get out of it and fight another day.
And then, of course, the unfortunate massacre at Pioli, there again, I must commend you that even though surprised, you were able to have an organized retreat. You were able to retrieve the cannon. So that was well handled, even though...
General, a massacre. There was 53 men lost. 53 men is still a tragedy, but 53 men is not a massacre. I got cleared. I begged you for an inquiry on that account, and when all the facts were made, I was exonerated, and my men were exonerated. My men served very valiantly that night, and I take great offense when people point and say we were unprepared. I believe we were prepared. We were overwhelmed. It's not one of my finest days, but my men did well with what they had at hand. And the massacre does not sit well with me as a term for that engagement.
Well, I understand. You were exonerated, and I agree with the result. It was an overwhelming force that came forth unexpected. So.
I feel myself very much injured until such time as you will be kind enough to indulge me with an inquiry into my conduct concerning the action of the night of the 20th instant. Conscious of having done my duty, I dare my accusers to a fair and candid hearing. Dark insinuations and insidious friends I dread, but from an open and avowed enemy, I have nothing to fear.
But then, of course, it was later that we moved into Germantown, and it was unfortunate that it all did not come off as we had hoped. It was the night march with the troops not being able to find their way on the roads, and then there was the morning fog, where detachments could not tell friend from foe.
It was a brilliant plan. Unfortunately, with the fog and, of course, the British setting fire to things and making smoke where my men could barely see a few rods in front of them, It was much confusion. Unfortunately, the communications, again, were not there. If it were, and we were more coordinated, we could have carried the day, and the British might have had to leave Philadelphia. But again, you know,
It was hoped. It was hoped for another Trenton or Princeton, but unfortunately, a series of events occurred that prevented that. I must, looking back on my own decision, ended up being a poor one. The incident at the Chew House. I know that there was a meeting of the officers, and Mr. Knox had mentioned that we should not leave a castle in our rear, and I concurred. I agreed, but then we did not realize how strong a house this was. He had 3-pound cannon, and it could not touch the house, and the 40th foot took position in there, and we lost much valuable time and many men trying to take the house, whereas it would have been better in retrospect just to have bypassed it.
Yes, unfortunately, I wasn't at that meeting, sir. You know,
Right.
I'm always pushing you to be more aggressive, pardon. It's your prerogative as a commander, but I'm always feel that our men are ready. The men I've trained are ready, and we need to attack. And sitting back and waiting to be attacked is not a tactic that would win the war for us. But you are the commander-in-chief, and you have saved us on many occasions by not listening to me. But in my mind, I think we should be more aggressive in our actions.
No, I've always admired. I would rather. I think of it in terms of the horse. I would rather have a horse that I'm trying to hold back rather than having a horse you're constantly trying to push. So I prefer the aggressive stance that you take. I'd rather have that issue. I'd rather be reining in a general rather than pushing a general.
Well, that's not a very flattering metaphor, sir, but I will take it. I
Yes.
appreciate it.
Well, I do hold horses in high regard.
Of course.
But in also too, we must not forget that in the larger political scheme, France was greatly impressed with Germantown. The fact that we had lost at Brandywine in a quite devastating way, and yet within a matter of weeks we were on the attack. So that was seen as a very critical moment in their decision to back us. The fact that we were losing badly, and yet we still attacked, and even though the attack was not ultimately successful, the very fact that we attempted it was made a huge impression on them. And of course, as we know, we could not have won the war, without the French. So even though, in one sense, tactically it was a loss, strategically it was a victory.
Yes.
Because it brought the French to that position where they felt comfortable backing us.
Well, nobody wants to back somebody constantly in retreat, sir.
Right.
So, and the men get discouraged when we're constantly in retreat. My men, when I give them an objective and get them moving forward, you can't stop them. And that's always been my theory. If we can get momentum and move forward, we should do it at all costs. And I will always push you for that, sir. And
No, I
apologize.
appreciate that. So at the close of Germantown, the decision was to be made where to winter the army. There was some thinking that we had been so badly beaten in so many ways that we should remove ourselves quite a distance. But then there were others, which I eventually concurred, was to be close to Philadelphia where the British had control, but yet have enough room to maneuver if they were to make a foray out of the capital. So basically, in that strategic sense, Valley Forge was the perfect location, situated by the river, some distance from Philadelphia, but yet it still showed that the army was alive and that we could also economically hurt the British, so that if we could contest with them for the forage and for the supplies of the area, that would put economic pressure without even interacting with them. The very fact that we were there, we could influence basically the competition for supplies. So in retrospect, looking back, I see now what Valley Forge was. It was really a crucible. It was a time where the Army not only survived, but with the help of General von Steuben, with his new tactics and his new drill manual, using the model company, and then taking that model company to train the rest of the Army. We got rid of all these various manuals because there were so many confusing manuals that we could not operate together as an Army. So even though there was great struggle, although I understand that already there was a misunderstanding about, it was not so much the cold, it was actually some of the warmth of caused problems. There was the rain.
The wetness.
There was a case in particular where we had a large supply train coming in, and because of the rain, the rivers were swollen, and we lost valuable equipage just going down the river. That's because of, if it had been colder perhaps and not had so much rain, that the supplies could have gotten through. But in the end, what we learned at Valley Forge with the drill manual under General von Steuben, that's what brought about what happened, the turning of events the following spring in Monmouth, because over the winter and the early spring, we got the final treaty with France that they were going to support us. And then of course, the British realized that their position was untenable with the introduction of the French Navy. They were very isolated and in a bad position in Philadelphia, so they had to leave. And then of course, we had the decision that we should not let them march unopposed across our country. We need to do something.
Absolutely, sir.
And that was when there was the contention, to not want to go out of my way speaking ill of General Charles Lee, but we were just, the two of us here, we can speak freely. But in the end, he never had a respect for our Army. In his mind, he always saw the British Army, being a former British officer himself, he always saw the British Army superior. And I think that affected his decisions in the battlefield and giving in too easily.
Yes, absolutely, sir. I understand what Lee did, but I was always, I mean, you know, at Valley Forge, I was foraging for you, trying to supply the Army, because I know that a well-supplied Army can fight. And we needed to fight that coming spring with the British in the area. We needed to keep our guard up and keep our forces strong. And you assigned me to foraging, and I took some ridicule for that, sir, but I would do that 1,000 times for you. You saw the vision, you knew what needed to be done, and I was willing to be your mechanism for doing that, sir. But when it came and the British were moving, I was pushing constantly for you to attack. Every board of war that you had, I was pushing for attack. General Lee, not so much. But we did. We followed him. We harassed the British and brought them into the field of battle. And we fought well. I mean, other than General Lee holding his position, and maybe in hindsight, pulling back a little might have been a good idea at the time, but he took it to an extreme, and my boys were left out, hanging on the field, unprotected, and thank God you arrived and pushed things to a point where we could continue the battle. The Monmouth, yes, sir, Monmouth was a very good demonstration of what a well-trained, cohesive Army that didn't have every colonel telling his regiment how to drill. Von Steuben and his regulations were a great asset to us, and we did well. Monmouth was a very good indication of what we were capable of, and we need to keep pushing.
And we held the ground. There were those who might dispute to say that it was a a draw, but the British objective was to pass through the area, which they did. But their objective was to destroy our army. They did not do that, and we held the ground. So personally, I see Monmouth as a victory. That's my personal view, and I did appreciate your activities, and I counted on you, as among other commanders, to turn the tide, because there was full retreat. I was completely shocked. I had to confront General Lee and express my complete shock as to what was happening. And if it was not for officers, generals like yourself, the battle could have turned out much differently. So it was a key moment in in this long struggle. Who would have thought that the war would have lasted 8 years? We never had no idea that it would last that long. But it was one of the key turning points in demonstrating the abilities of the Army to recover in a bad situation. And as they were so well trained, and the one Storyman drill manual, they were able to execute perfect a change from a retreat into the attack. I quite frankly believe that many of the British officers were quite astounded.
I believe you're right, sir.
Seeing the change, they did not recognize this army. It was not the army they had seen earlier. It was a disciplined army on the same footing as under British discipline. And so I cannot say enough for General Storyman and his efforts. And I too want to thank you for your efforts during the battle and changing the direction in which it was heading.
I just did what you wanted me to do, sir, what I felt needed to be done. And I believe Monmouth was convincing on several fronts. It convinced the French that we were a valuable ally, even more than before. Convinced the British that we were a force to be contended with, not in contempt. Also convinced our men and our officers that we can meet these people on the field and not shrink away. It's an incredible turning point for our war.
And I can't say enough for also General Knox and his placement of the cannon. I believe that historians may reflect that it's probably the largest amount of cannon involved in the war. And I know that his placement of the cannon on that particular hill was devastating for the British. So we can't say enough for the use of artillery and that effect. There again, that reflects on the General Knox and his use of artillery. But that is something that should not be forgotten either.
Yes, it was a tremendous display. It encouraged us, and it was a joy to behold, to see us moving and all our branches working together like that. It was very encouraging.
Excellent.
Yes, General, the confidence of the Army is at an all-time high, and I really appreciate your indulgence with letting me attack that rock at Stony Point. My men really were anxious for a little payback from the Paoli massacre. My men, we marched and with your permission, and we planned a very good attack, surprised them. Much valor was shown that night. I was actually shot in the head that night.
Yes, that was a very close call.
Yeah, well, and I wasn't about to stop, sir. I was there with my men trying to push them over the hill and for some payback for...
I understand it was a spent musket ball that glanced your...
Yeah, it still bothers me to this day, sir, but I would do it 1,000 more times for what we were able to achieve that night. It was one of our crowning achievements of our Army, and it sent a great message to our adversaries. Storming that position was one of the high points of my life, sir. And I appreciate the opportunity to serve you and serve our country in that manner.
Stony Point, 16th July, 1779. Dear General, I have now the pleasure to assure you that the surrender of the fort at Stony Point and transmit you herewith a return of killed, wounded, prisoners, ordnance, and military stores. It is with infinite satisfaction I acknowledge to you that the officers and men under my command behaved with the greatest bravery and fortitude.
I was able to scout the position there again I had mentioned before about our surveyor and engineering department, that it's amazing what you can see with a very powerful spyglass. I'm not talking about not a handheld spyglass as shown here, but one that's actually mounted on a tripod. That we've actually found out that you can see detail, like even on uniform, from a mile away. So using this type of instrument, I was able to survey the defenses at Stony Point, and I could see the abatis, the sharpened stakes that went down to the water line. They did not go far enough. There was a weakness. So in studying their lack of fortifications in this area, I realized they were vulnerable. And then, of course, as we discussed, I gave you considerable latitude and how you want to make the approach. But it could not have gone more perfectly. You had your diversionary force in the west, and then, of course, you overwhelmed them from the south, and also the force from the north very quickly. In the larger sense, 1779, there was not a lot going on, and we needed to show that we could do something aggressive, something assertive, an attack to let the British know we're still in the war. And that is a vital crossing, which helped us later in the war, getting the army from Verplancks Point to Stony Point on their way to Yorktown. So that it still is a strategic crossing. And of course, I decided that after I entered the fort and congratulated you and the troops, that we were in turn were vulnerable.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So it was, the discretion was the part of valor. You made the attack, you made the assault, but I think it was best that we destroyed everything that was there, took the cannon, and vacated.
Yes. It was rather disheartening to me and my boys, but I understood the decision. I would much rather fortify it and stay there as a thorn in the British side, but I understand.
But then the British couldn't keep it.
Yes.
Then they in turn saw that they were vulnerable, and so then that led perfectly to us taking the position later, which in turn helped us with our movement, which was undetected, getting all the troops to Yorktown. But there was something else the following year, as we know, the great troubling turning of Arnold, which I can hardly mention the name and the great disdain I have for it. I want to be careful how I say this. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but in certain ways you had similarities. Both, you were two of my most aggressive generals, and yet on that series of circumstances, I can only speculate that I understand that he felt financially that he was in arrears. He had felt that he had been looked over for command, and then of course he married a loyalist wife into a loyalist family. But in the end, it was you that made that tremendous night march, covering all those miles to bring support to West Point, because the British plan being for them to take it.
Yes.
And then, of course, I must commend you for that amazing night march.
Yeah.
It is with singular pleasure that General Wayne obeys an order so truly honorable to a corps which he has had the happiness so long to command. The ready cheerfulness with which every order has been carried into execution, and the manly and soldierly fortitude exhibited by both officers and men in encountering death, danger, and enduring every possible extreme of cold, hunger, and fatigue, justly entitles them to the esteem of their country and to the most grateful acknowledgments and thanks of their general, which he begs them to accept, and to be assured that the highest ambition is to merit the confidence of the corps so eminently distinguished as the American Light Infantry.
Well, you know, the men and officers of the Army are much aggrieved throughout the war. And it's no fault of yours, it's more of Congress's inability to see what is going on in the field and to procure things to make the Army stronger or even able to stay in the field. No shoes, no food, no clothes. As you know, I'm always trying to do my best for the men under my command, but the Congress, try as they may, but their hands are tied and are unable to actually do procurement. They aren't able to tax. They aren't able to force things to happen. So politics and the hardship, I mean, I can understand where that man would feel that way. I felt like I should have left the Army several times, but and I'm sorry to have to embarrass you, sir, but the love for you and the love for our country was one of the things that kept me in the Army and what keeps our men in the field and moving forward. And so I would like to thank you for your presence, your leadership, which is something this country is definitely going to need moving on, sir.
Well, you are clearly cut from a different cloth than Mr. Arnold. I must say that as he moves to his new country, I predict that he will not be accepted in his new land because no one wants a traitor.
Sir, once a traitor, always a traitor, sir.
Indeed. So I believe that that name will be synonymous in our history of our new country for generations. The name Arnold will be connected with treachery. But yes, very different in the decisions that you made and remaining faithful to the cause in light of all the struggles. And it is a shame because all throughout, in terms of the supply of food, all throughout the war, there was ample harvests. There were no blights. It was the matter of the states coming to the table to provide the food that was necessary, and also the transportation problem of getting the food to the soldiers. But yes, there do need to be changes in our government long term. But another concern that I had was, of course, the mutiny of the Pennsylvania line in 1781. Now, that was a very precarious, dangerous time in the history of our Army.
Well, yes, but again, Congress was warned over and over by me personally. I did my best to keep my men happy and keep them fortified, but when Congress, and again, it's really no fault of their own, it's these darned Articles of Confederation which tie their hands to get anything done. If you're going to have 13 individual colonies or states trying to procure, and the Jersey boys are not getting what the Pennsylvania boys are getting, and the Pennsylvania boys are suddenly neglected by their own government. Yeah, there was hardship and grievances. Thank God they weren't in the mind to defect. I give them great credit, and I encourage them not to do so. And they swore to me that they would shoot the first man that talked about defecting to the enemy. That was not their intent. They wanted to have their grievances addressed, and moving forward, they wanted to be treated like citizens of a great nation. And they should be, because they've sacrificed just like you and I have, sir.
And the British knew. Of course, they have their spy network.
Yes.
And they sent the two spies to try to encourage the defection.
They tried.
Yes.
They tried, and much to my men's credit, they rebuked them and were treating them as traitors. Luckily, when I stayed with them and went to Philadelphia to meet with representatives, most of their grievances were addressed, and those that were able to leave or wanted to leave were able to leave. Some stayed on. I do regret that the Pennsylvania line was basically disbanded and taken away from me, but I understand. You have a bunch of grieve men together is probably not the best thing to keep them together. But there were other mutinies too, sir. The Jersey mutiny was not
Yes,
very
of
well.
course. We had to be more firm. We were lenient with the
Yes.
Pennsylvania line, but once it started to spread, we had to be very firm. And it saddens my heart that some of the ringleaders had to be hung.
Yes, no, it was a
It had to
message that
stop,
had to be
because
sent.
otherwise it was going to spread throughout the army.
It was a
It had to
message that had to be
stop.
sent. So,
But still, it was a sad day for the army that these things had to take place. But as you say, the men had legitimate grievances, and it has been a very, very difficult war in that regard.
but the Congress cannot expect men to go without pay, and without food, and without clothes for years on end and not expect to have a problem.
Oh, precisely.
So,
Full agreement.
So hopefully moving forward, and sir, hopefully with your leadership, we can get to that point where we have a functioning government as opposed to a government made up of all these little factions.
Exactly.
And I understand. After what we've all gone through, both of us have gone through, relatively unscathed, but it's been exhausting. We've both grown older in the service. But I beg you, sir, not to hang up your sword and take up the plow. We need you moving forward, sir. And I know there's other people in the service, among the officers and men, that agree with me. I know there's talk of kingship for you, and I know that I'm more of a Caesar lover. I think an emperorship would be probably more to my liking, but I know that's not what you care to partake.
No, that is not the right path. But of course, the critical, which we didn't understand perhaps at the time, was the movement on Yorktown. And everything, of course, came together. We got word from the French that de Grasse was going to be in place with his fleet. And then, of course, there was the action off the Chesapeake Capes, the naval action there. But the main issue was how to get the troops down there without being noticed, which are moving thousands of troops without being noticed, very difficult. So we had, of course, using our culper spy ring and other methods, we convinced the British that we were actually going to attack New York City.
Which is what I was advising all along, so,
Right.
so you fooled me too. When I was set south with Greene and Lafayette, I was actually upset because I was moving away from where the action was. I had no idea what the grand plan was. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad it came to fruition. So.
And it is hoped that the efforts of General Greene are remembered, because in his campaigns in the South, even though each battle was technically lost, with each battle he was weakening Cornwallis. And this eventually caused Cornwallis to have to re-equip and refit in Yorktown, which eventually trapped him. So even though Greene, I hope he gets General Greene gets the recognition that he deserves for these campaigns of weakening the British Army to such an extent that they had to go to Yorktown. And then, of course, we were able to move troops undetected. And that crossing that we talked about earlier, for Planks Point and Stony Point, were critical, that we had the ability to ferry the troops at that time in preparation for marching to Yorktown. And of course, there again, without the help of the French, it could not have been done. And it must be remembered, as I just shared, about the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes, when they beat thoroughly the British Navy. And then when Cornwallis looked out with his spyglass and saw only French flags on the shipping, he knew the game was up. He was trapped. And then, of course, the movements against his fortifications and the seizing of redoubts number 9 and 10. Very proud of young Mr. Hamilton and his activities with the light troops. And I know you've been very involved with the light troops. I know they're very close to your heart.
I wasn't able to take part in that attack, but some of my men were, and very proud of their actions that day. And it was the nail in the coffin for Cornwallis to seal off his escape routes and make the noose a little tighter. Well.
But then, of course, we ended up after Yorktown, the British still being in New York City. I had to have a post to keep an eye on New York City to not get be too close to it. And of course, Newburgh, where we are now, ended up being the perfect location to provide enough distance between New York City in case they did try for an attack, but yet close enough that I could keep an eye on them. But you may not be aware, but much has happened here.
Well, I would like to hear about it, sir. So, I mean, if you would indulge me, I would like to hear.
But of course, there was a very strange affair that I kind of hope that it does not get widely publicized, but it may come out eventually. But there was the very odd letter I received from a Colonel Nicola. And we were speaking earlier about the frustrations with Congress.
Yes, sir.
And he had a very odd scheme. He believes that the only answer for our country is to form a new country in the West. In other words, it's to separate, to have have the various soldiers in the army to be given lands in the far West beyond our current borders. And then he had this very odd suggestion. I think part of it is that all he could think about, being English himself, having served in the British Army, you could only picture a monarchy. And so his suggestion being that there should be a king of this new land to the west, the title specifically of king. Now, here is the confusion. He has written the letter to me. Is he implying that I should be king? Or is he just saying that there should be a king? I believe the future historians will find this most curious and have a hard time understanding, but I very distinctly wrote him back saying, you must banish these thoughts from your mind. Now, I hope that the future historians will not look too disrespectfully on Colonel Nicola. This was a very bizarre scheme and fraught with problems. But we must not forget that he provided valuable service to this country, and that it was his idea to have the invalid corps. In other words, to take soldiers that they cannot serve in the regular way, but for garrison duty. He got this idea from the British Army, the invalid corps, so that even though they may have a limp or they may have some issues, they can still handle a musket and they can still perform garrison duties. This was very helpful. We were short on troops, so we could take troops that were recovering or invalids and use them in other ways. And also, with his knowledge of French, he took 2 valuable French military books and translated them into English. And these services alone were invaluable. So I know that it was a very odd letter, and he sent me 2 letters of apology because he felt so bad that I was so upset by this. And then, but this does reflect another troubling conspiracy, that he was writing this letter because he was upset about the things we were talking about earlier, about the lack of leadership with the Congress. So there was a letter circulated about a meeting of the officers. And of course, I was left out of this. And of course, people did tell me about it, what was happening. But now it was the officer corps in general in this area was actually considering perhaps even marching on Congress. And this was a very very disturbing, very troubling thing. Now, on the one hand, I know in your letter that you shared with me that you are, of course, in our conversation now, you have also continued with your concerns about Congress, and of course I am very concerned about the weakness of our government. But I was particularly troubled on how to deal with this. So I gave them permission to have this meeting where they were going to discuss their grievances and so forth, but I did not tell them that I was going to make a surprise appearance. So now we were at, of course, this was on, I believe it was March the 15th. Now we're in 1782. So I made the appearance. To their shock, I had prepared remarks, and I could tell that they made no impression. I went through great difficulty writing these remarks, and I felt that they would make a difference, but I could see they were having no effect. So I remembered that I had in my pocket, I had a letter from a congressman, which I felt would be helpful. And I went to read it, and I recognized that immediately it was in a small hand, and I could not read it. So what I came to the fact was these very spectacles that I had just received only perhaps a couple of months before, and I put on the spectacles, and of course the officers were shocked. They'd never seen me with spectacles. And I said, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me, my spectacles, for not only have I grown gray, but almost half blind in service of my country." It didn't matter what I said after that. There was not a dry eye in the room. So is it not remarkable that the rebellion of the officers was ended, and perhaps by a simple pair of spectacles? Quite unusual. But I must go on, because I know you've raised your concerns, and the concerns of the officers, they are legitimate. I am concerned about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So what I've done throughout the war is I've written what I refer to as these circular letters to the governors. So basically what it is, it's the identical letter, but there are copies sent to each individual governor, the different states. So as I had time in Newburgh here, I composed a final circular letter, and I knew you were coming, I knew you were concerned, so I felt the best way to help you is to read some excerpts from this letter that I wrote to the governors. And please pardon the spectacles, it has become necessary. So I had basically 4 main concerns that I wanted to address. The first being an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head. And this is what I wrote. The great object for which I had the honor to hold an appointment in the service of my country being accomplished, I am now preparing to resign it into the hands of Congress. Before I carry this resolution into effect, I think it is my duty to offer my thoughts respecting some important subjects and give my final blessing to that country in whose service I have spent the prime of my life, for whose sake I have consumed so many anxious days and watchful nights. The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at a time when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than any former period. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, legislatures, through a long succession of years are laid open for our use, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our forms of government, the free cultivation of letters, the unbounded extension of commerce, the progressive refinement of manners, and above all, the pure light of revelation. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation. For according to the system of policy the states shall adopt at this moment, They will stand or fall, and by their confirmation or lapse is yet to be decided. Whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse, not the present age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved. Whether it be expedient for the states to delegate a larger proportion of power to Congress or not, yet it will be a part of my duty and that of every true patriot to assert without reserve and to insist upon the following positions: that unless the states will suffer Congress to exercise these prerogatives, everything must very rapidly tend to anarchy and confusion, that it is indispensable to the happiness of the individual states that there should be lodged somewhere a supreme power to regulate and govern the general concerns of the Confederated Republic, without which the Union cannot be of long duration. There must be a faithful and pointed compliance on every part of every state, or the most fatal consequences will ensue. It will be a subject of regret that so much blood and treasure have been lavished for no purpose, that so many sufferings have been encountered without compensation, and that so many sacrifices have been made in vain. Another concern, number two, is that of a sacred regard to public justice. And what I mean in this is that we have incurred tremendous debt. And in this debt, there is a great danger. We are indebted to the French and, of course, the Dutch. And if we are not careful that this debt is not repaid, who knows? There may be desires for these countries to take ownership of land in this country to pay for this debt. So it is critical that we deal with this debt, that it's paid in a timely manner as we form our new nation. Another concern, which perhaps you may be interested in, is the peace establishment. Now, in a separate letter to the Congress, which I had written earlier, I outlined in great detail what the Army should look like after the war, because there is a need to maintain an armed presence in this country. And of course, there is this fear of a standing army. That somehow we have to get past this constant worry, because there is a need to have a standing army. I've even calculated 2,631 would be the number that I found that is the smallest that we can have. I'm trying to keep the number small because of this fear for the standing army. But not only must we have a standing army, but the desperate need for engineers, whatever we need, we've seen this time and time again, the desperate need for engineers. We must have a military academy. We cannot be constantly depending on the Europeans to provide the educated soldiers and officers for the engineering needs. We must have our own academy. So that is another area that I have been peace establishment, and perhaps in that regard we could use your services after the war. And then another part is almost philosophical, but the well-being of our country needs to be looked at. Now, the prevalence of that pacific and friendly disposition among the peoples of the United States, which will induce them to forget their local prejudices and policies, to make those mutual concessions which are requisite to the general prosperity, and in some instances, to sacrifice their individual advantages to the interest of the community. So as you can see, General Wayne, I have put some considerable thought into the future of this country, and I believe that it is critical that when the war is finally over and the British have left, that there has to be many changes, significant changes have to be made to our governing system.
I agree wholeheartedly, sir. And I hope, as I said before, I hope that you are not going to leave this into the hands of other men. This country needs leadership, needs good men like you, sir. And I'm afraid you have a lot of work ahead of you if this country is going to succeed. If we leave this sort of thing up to Congress, I feel it'll fail. And I do plead with you, sir.
Well, I must confess, my current thoughts are simply to return to my plantation. It is, as I discovered, the only time I visited it was during the Yorktown campaign. And I was troubled by I know I've had various managers looking over things, but they have not been looking over it to my liking, and it has really come under mismanagement and disrepair, but so I need to focus on that. But there are many able men that can step forward.
I thank divine providence that you and I were able to get through this great ordeal relatively unscathed. But I can tell you, sir, right now that if Anthony Wayne were to fall in battle, I would be a footnote in history. But you, sir, General Washington would have fallen or failed. I believe our whole cause would have failed. So I believe this country needs men like you, men that other men are willing to follow. So please, I understand your reluctance to stay in the public eye, but the needs of the many might outweigh the needs of the one, sir.
Well, your kind words are greatly appreciated. I thank you so much.
Coming soon, a new exhibit at Washington's headquarters. Explore different perspectives on George Washington's life and legacy. Contact Washington's headquarters for more information about this exhibit and for visiting the site in person.